When Charles II became King of Spain, the empire looked intact. Palaces stood, titles endured, ceremonies continued. But beneath the appearance of stability, the system that had sustained the Habsburg dynasty was already failing. This is not the story of a collapse. It's the story of how power can appear permanent, right up until the moment it isn't. The year is 1700. Across the courts of Europe, ambassadors and ministers wait with barely concealed anticipation. In Madrid, a man lies dying. He is 38 years old, though his body resembles that of someone far older. His physicians have long since given up hope. Foreign observers have been predicting his death for decades. Yet somehow, impossibly, he has clung to life far longer than anyone expected. His name is Charles II of Spain, and his impending death will unleash a continental war that will reshape the balance of power in Europe for generations to come. But the story of Charles II is not simply one of physical decline and dynastic failure. It is a story about the illusion of stability, about how a monarchy and an empire can appear to function even when its very foundation is crumbling. For nearly 4 decades, Charles presided over a Spanish empire that stretched across 4 continents, an empire that continued to wage wars, conduct diplomacy, and maintain its position as a major European power, all while being ruled by a man who could barely walk, speak, or govern. How did this happen? How did Spain maintain the illusion of stability for so long? And what does Charles II's reign tell us about the nature of monarchy, power, and the resilience of institutions in the face of human frailty? Charles was born on the 6th of November, 1661, the second son of King Philip IV of Spain and his second wife, Mariana of Austria. His birth was greeted with relief, bordering on desperation. Just 5 days earlier, his elder brother, Felipe Prospero, had died, leaving the Spanish Habsburg dynasty without a male heir. Philip IV was 60 years old, and his health was failing. The birth of Prince Carlos represented what many saw as a miracle, a divine intervention that would preserve the Habsburg line in Spain. But the miracle was an illusion. From the very beginning, Charles was not a healthy child. French agents sent to Madrid to assess the newborn prince reported back to King Louis XIV with alarming details. The child was weak, covered in eczema and scales. Pus had been oozing from the right side of his neck for 3 weeks, a condition carefully hidden from public view. The French were not even certain the child was male, and Louis XIV would continue to suspect for years that the Spanish court had dressed up a princess as a prince to maintain the fiction of a male heir. The root of Charles' problems lay in his ancestry. His family tree was less a tree than a tangled knot. His mother, Mariana of Austria, was the daughter of Holy Roman Emperor Ferdinand III and Maria Ana of Spain, who was the younger sister of Charles' father. In other words, Charles' mother was also his first cousin. This marriage between uncle and niece was not unusual for the Habsburgs. Between the Spanish and Austrian branches of the family, there had been 11 such marriages over the previous century and a half. Charles's paternal grandfather, Philip III, was also his maternal great-grandfather. His maternal great-grandfather, Emperor Ferdinand II, was the brother of his paternal grandmother. The Habsburg family had been intermarrying for so long that Charles's coefficient of inbreeding was higher than if his parents had been siblings. The consequences of this inbreeding were written on Charles' body. He had the famous Habsburg jaw, a protruding lower jaw, so pronounced that his teeth did not meet properly, making it difficult for him to chew food or speak clearly. He suffered from what modern medical historians believe was hydrocephalus, a buildup of cerebrospinal fluid in the brain that caused cognitive impairment and contributed to his many other ailments. He had digestive problems, frequent infections, and episodes of illness that left him bedridden for days or weeks at a time. Of his mother's 9 pregnancies, 6 had resulted in stillbirths, or children who died shortly after birth. Charles himself was not expected to survive childhood, and yet he did survive. This is the first illusion of stability surrounding Charles II. Despite his many ailments, despite the predictions of his imminent death that circulated throughout Europe from the time he was an infant, Charles lived for nearly 40 years. He outlived his father, his half-brother, both his wives and many of the courtiers and ministers who served him. His survival became a kind of political fact around which European diplomacy had to organize itself. Plans for the partition of the Spanish Empire, carefully negotiated by the great powers, had to be repeatedly revised and updated as Charles stubbornly refused to die on schedule. Charles was not yet 4 years old when his father died on the 17th of September 1665. The boy could not yet walk. He could barely speak. The idea that he could exercise royal power was absurd, and yet, legally, he was the king. On the day of Philip IV's death, the royal governess sat on the throne, holding the infant king in her arms as courtiers came to kiss his hand and swear their allegiance. When the ceremony was interrupted because Charles began to cry and needed to be fed, the courtiers waited patiently until he was ready to continue. This was the theater of monarchy, the performance that maintained the illusion that Spain had a functioning king. The reality, of course, was that power lay elsewhere. Philip IV's will had named Charles's mother, Queen Mariana, as regent during her son's minority, which was to last until he turned 14. Mariana was given extensive powers, ruling in the same manner and with the same authority as her late husband. She was to have the entire government and direction of all my kingdoms in peace and war. This was not unusual. Habsburg women had long exercised significant political power. Charles V's aunt and sister had effectively ruled the Netherlands for half a century. Philip IV's first wife had served as regent during his military campaigns. The tradition of powerful queenship in the Habsburg lands stretched back to Isabella of Castile, who had ruled in her own right. Mariana proved to be a capable and determined ruler. She faced significant challenges from the beginning. Spain was still at war with Portugal, which had rebelled against Spanish rule in 1640 and was now supported by England. France, under the ambitious Louis XIV, was a constant threat to Spanish territories in the Netherlands and Italy. Domestically, Spain faced economic crisis, with the crown spending 70% of its revenues on debt service. Mariana had to navigate these challenges while also managing the factions at court, including the powerful Don Juan José de Austria, Philip IV's illegitimate son, who believed he should have a major role in the government. What is striking about Mariana's regency is how it maintained the appearance of continuity and stability, despite the fact that the king was a small child who could not walk or speak properly, despite the obvious physical and mental limitations that would prevent him from ever ruling effectively. The machinery of government continued to function. Councils met, decisions were made, wars were fought, treaties were negotiated. The fiction that Spain had a king was maintained through careful staging and performance. When Charles made his first public appearance at age 6, traveling in a royal carriage to pay homage to the patron saint of the Spanish monarchy, he was loudly acclaimed by the crowds. The people wanted them to believe in their king, and Mariana gave them a king to believe in, even if that king was still essentially a child. Mariana also took seriously her responsibility to prepare Charles for kingship, despite his obvious limitations. She appointed skilled tutors, including Francisco Ramos del Manzano, a distinguished lawyer and diplomat. She hired dance teachers and musicians to provide courtly education. The Marquis of Aitona organized military training, building a miniature fortress in the royal playground for the young king to play with. These efforts were not merely for show. Mariana genuinely seems to have believed, or at least hoped, that Charles could be prepared to exercise at least some of his royal functions when he came of age. The illusion of stability that Mariana created during her regency was tested repeatedly. In 1667, Louis XIV invaded the Spanish Netherlands, claiming that local laws gave his wife, Maria Theresa, Philip IV's eldest daughter, the right of succession. Mariana responded by making peace with Portugal, freeing up Spanish resources to confront France, and by organizing a triple alliance with England, the Netherlands, and Sweden that forced Louis to accept peace in 1668. When Don Juan challenged her authority and threatened to march on Madrid, Mariana leveraged her most important political asset, her son. The 6-year-old Charles made carefully choreographed public appearances, reminding the Spanish elite that opposing Mariana meant opposing their king. As Charles approached his 14th birthday in 1675, the question of his majority became urgent. Philip IV's will had envisaged that Mariana would continue to hold power until Charles turned 25, but her formal authority as regent was to end when he turned 14. Charles was now a teenager, still suffering from his many ailments, but occasionally described in contemporary accounts as energetic, particularly when hunting. The question was whether he was capable of ruling, and if not, how power would be transferred. Here we see another layer of the illusion. In November 1675, 2 days before Charles's 14th birthday, Mariana and her Regency Council requested an extension of the regency for another 2 years. To her surprise, Charles refused. He announced that he had been in contact with Don Juan and intended to bring him to Madrid as his chief advisor. Was this really Charles's decision? Or was it the work of courtiers who had been whispering in his ear, using the young king as a pawn in their own power struggles? We cannot know for certain. What we do know is that Mariana and Charles reached a compromise. She would relinquish the formal regency, but the Regency Council would remain in place with her at its head. When Don Juan arrived in Madrid expecting to take power, Charles was persuaded to send him away. The compromise lasted only a little over a year. In January 1677, Don Juan marched on Madrid with 15,000 men, forcing a crisis. Charles sought advice from neutral courtiers, who told him that his obligations to the state superseded his obligations to his mother. On the night of the 14th of January, Charles secretly left the royal palace. A few days later, he made a public appearance that was greeted with popular acclaim. Don Juan took over as head of the government, and Mariana was sent into exile in Toledo. This episode reveals the fundamental paradox of Charles II's reign. Here was a young man who was widely known to be physically and mentally impaired, who had grown up completely under his mother's control, suddenly asserting his independence and making what appeared to be major political decisions. Was Charles really in charge, or was he simply a figurehead being manipulated by different factions at court? The evidence suggests something more complex. Charles was not a cipher. He had his own will, his own desires, his own capacity for decision-making, however limited. But he was also profoundly dependent on those around him, and his decisions were always shaped and constrained by the political context in which he operated. The illusion of stability during this period was maintained through a kind of collective fiction. Everyone at court knew that Charles was not a normal king. Everyone knew about his physical and mental limitations, and yet everyone acted as if he were capable of ruling. Courtiers sought his favor, ministers presented him with policy options, ambassadors negotiated with him. The machinery of monarchy required a king, and so Charles was treated as a king, even when it was obvious that real power lay elsewhere. Don Juan's regime lasted only 2 years. He fell ill and died in September 1679, and Mariana returned to Madrid. Charles, now reconciled with his mother, appointed the Duke of Medinaceli as his chief minister. Medinaceli was succeeded in 1685 by the Count of Oropesa. Both men were capable administrators who attempted to address Spain's economic problems through currency reform and more efficient tax collection. They also had to manage Spain's ongoing conflicts with France, which continued to threaten Spanish territories in the Netherlands and Italy. What is remarkable about this period is how ordinary it seems. Spain was governed by a succession of ministers who made policy decisions, managed the economy, and conducted foreign affairs, much as ministers in any other European monarchy would do. The king attended council meetings, received ambassadors, and performed ceremonial functions. To outside observers, Spain appeared to be functioning more or less normally. The illusion of stability was so complete that it was easy to forget that the king at the center of this system was a man who could barely speak or chew his food, who suffered from frequent illnesses, and who was widely believed to be incapable of producing an heir. The question of the succession became increasingly urgent as Charles entered his 20s and 30s without producing a child. He had married Marie Louise of Orléans, Louis XIV's niece, in 1679. Contemporary accounts suggest that Charles made considerable efforts in the marital bed, but the queen remained barren. Marie-Louise fell into depression and died in 1689 after a riding accident, amid rumors that she had been poisoned. Charles then married Marie Anna of Neuburg in 1690, but this marriage also failed to produce an heir. The failure to produce an heir was not just a personal tragedy for Charles, it threatened to destabilize the entire European order. Spain's empire was vast, stretching from the Netherlands to Naples, from Mexico to the Philippines. Who would inherit this empire after Charles died? The question consumed European diplomacy for decades. There were three main candidates. The first was the Austrian Habsburg line, represented by Archduke Charles, the younger son of Emperor Leopold I. The second was the French Bourbon line, represented by Philip of Anjou, the grandson of Louis XIV. The third was Joseph Ferdinand of Bavaria, the son of Charles' niece, Maria Antonia, who was seen as a neutral compromise candidate. Charles himself was deeply invested in the succession question, despite his limitations. He understood that his most important duty as king was to preserve the integrity of the Spanish monarchy and empire. In 1696, he signed a will naming Joseph Ferdinand as his heir. When Joseph Ferdinand died suddenly in 1699 at age 6, Charles announced that Archduke Charles would inherit the empire undivided. But in October 1700, just weeks before his own death, Charles was persuaded to change his will one final time, naming Philip of Anjou as his heir on the condition that he renounce any claims to the French throne. This final change of will is one of the most significant political acts of Charles's reign, and it raises profound questions about his agency and capacity for decision-making. Who really made this decision? Was it Charles himself acting on his own judgment about what was best for Spain, or was it Cardinal Portocarrero and other pro-French courtiers manipulating a dying man who no longer had the strength to resist? The historical evidence is ambiguous. What we know is that Charles was seriously ill in the fall of 1700, barely able to eat or move. We also know that he had shown throughout his reign a stubborn determination to preserve his empire intact, and that he resented the attempts by foreign powers to partition his inheritance. The decision to name Philip of Anjou as his sole heir, rather than accepting a partition, was consistent with this determination. Charles died on the 1st of November 1700, 5 days before his 39th birthday. His autopsy revealed the full extent of his physical deterioration. He had a shrunken heart, corroded lungs, gangrenous intestines, kidney stones, and a head full of water. He had a single testicle, described as black as coal. It was, as one observer noted, a miracle that he had lived as long as he did. The death of Charles II brought the illusion of stability crashing down. Within weeks, Philip of Anjou was proclaimed King Philip IV of Spain, but Louis XIV refused to exclude him from the French line of succession, raising the specter of a united Franco-Spanish monarchy. The Holy Roman Empire, England, and the Netherlands formed a grand alliance to prevent this outcome. And Europe was plunged into the War of the Spanish Succession, a conflict that would last 13 years and result in hundreds of thousands of casualties. The war ended with the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, which confirmed Philip V as King of Spain, but forced him to renounce his claims to the French throne and to cede large parts of the Spanish Empire to his rivals. Britain received Gibraltar and Minorca. Austria received the Spanish Netherlands, Milan, Naples, and Sardinia. The Spanish Empire that Charles had fought so hard to preserve intact was partitioned, after all. So what are we to make of Charles II and his reign? The traditional narrative portrays him as a tragic figure, a victim of dynastic inbreeding who was incapable of ruling and whose reign represented the nadir of Spanish decline. There is much truth to this narrative. Charles was indeed severely impaired, both physically and mentally. His inability to produce an heir did indeed lead directly to a catastrophic war. And Spain's power and prestige did indeed decline significantly during his reign. But this narrative misses something important. Despite Charles's limitations, despite the obvious dysfunction at the heart of the Spanish monarchy, the system continued to function for nearly 4 decades. Spain maintained a large army and fought in multiple wars. Spanish diplomats negotiated treaties and formed alliances. The Spanish economy, while troubled, did not collapse. Reforms were implemented that laid the groundwork for recovery in the 18th century. The empire held together, more or less, until Charles's death. This was the illusion of stability. It was an illusion because it depended on a collective fiction, on everyone agreeing to act as if Spain had a functional king when it clearly did not. But it was also more than an illusion, because the fiction had real effects. By maintaining the forms and rituals of monarchy, By treating Charles as a king even when he could barely function, the Spanish court and government created a framework within which political life could continue. The illusion provided stability because people believed in it, or at least acted as if they believed in it. This tells us something important about the nature of monarchy and political power in early modern Europe. We often think of monarchs as all-powerful individuals who personally directed the affairs of their kingdoms. But the case of Charles II shows that monarchy was as much about institutions, rituals, and collective fictions as it was about individual rulers. A king did not need to be personally capable or competent for the monarchy to function. He simply needed to exist, to occupy the role of king, to provide a focal point around which the machinery of government could organize itself. Charles II's reign also reveals the remarkable resilience of the Spanish monarchy and empire. Spain in the late 17th century faced enormous challenges: economic crisis, military defeats, the loss of Portugal, constant pressure from France. The monarchy itself was led by a man who could barely walk or speak. And yet Spain endured. It maintained its empire, fought its wars, and preserved its position as a major European power. This resilience was not due to Charles's personal qualities, but to the strength of Spanish institutions, the loyalty of Spanish subjects, and the determination of Spanish elites to maintain their power and prestige. The question of Charles' personal agency remains difficult to answer. Was he simply a pawn, manipulated by his mother, his ministers, and various court factions? Or did he have some capacity for independent decision-making? The evidence suggests that the truth lies somewhere in between. Charles was profoundly limited by his physical and mental impairments. He was dependent on those around him, in ways that a healthy monarch would not be. His decisions were always shaped by the advice and pressure he received from courtiers and ministers. But Charles was not entirely passive. He showed at times a stubborn determination to assert his own will. His refusal to extend his mother's regency in 1675, his decision to separate himself from her in 1677, his insistence on preserving the integrity of his empire in his succession planning, all suggest a man who had his own desires and priorities, however limited his ability to act on them. Charles understood his duty as king, and within the constraints of his abilities, he tried to fulfill it. The final change of Charles' will in favor of Philip of Anjou was perhaps his most consequential decision. It led directly to the War of the Spanish Succession and the partition of the Spanish Empire. Was this really Charles' decision? We cannot know for certain, but it was consistent with his lifelong determination to preserve his empire intact. And it reflected a realistic assessment that France was better positioned than Austria to defend Spanish interests. In this sense, Charles's final act as king was not simply the manipulation of a dying man, but a genuine political decision that shaped the course of European history. The illusion of stability that characterized Charles II's reign ultimately could not survive his death. The succession crisis that everyone had anticipated for decades finally arrived, and it brought war and partition. But the illusion had served its purpose. It had given Spain nearly 4 decades of relative stability, time to adjust to its reduced circumstances, time to implement reforms, time to prepare for a new dynasty. When Philip V finally took the throne after the War of the Spanish Succession, he inherited a kingdom that, while diminished, was still intact and still capable of recovery. In the end, Charles II's reign was both a failure and a success. It was a failure in the most obvious sense. Charles could not produce an heir, and his death led to a catastrophic war. But it was a success in a deeper sense. The monarchy survived, the empire mostly held together, and the foundations were laid for Spain's eventual recovery in the 18th century. The illusion of stability, maintained through ritual, performance, and collective fiction, was enough to carry Spain through one of the most difficult periods in its history. Charles II died as he had lived, a king in name who embodied the contradictions of his age. He was powerful and powerless,